welcome to the Maritime and Trade Talk podcast brought to you by S&P Global. My name is Ravi Amin. I am a trade compliance subject matter expert working within the Maritime and Trade team. I provide expertise to financial institutions in all things related to trade finance, and this mostly covers sanctions compliance, regional export control regulations on dual-use goods and military goods, and then vessel compliance and behavioral analytics as well. I'm joined today by Girish Hanuma Gowada. Girish, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Ravi. My name is Girish Hanuma, part of the Maritime Trade and Supply Chain team. My role within the organization is as a subject matter expert when it comes to our trade finance related solutions. Ravi, can you quickly provide us a synopsis of the different aspects of the white paper that you've written as an update to the one which was released earlier in the May?
Yeah, so this is the August update white paper. And essentially what we've done is we've looked at some of the things that we reported on in the one that was released in May, and we've provided some updated analysis. So we have looked at the recent vessel activity in high risk areas. So the one that we focused on is the JWC zone in and around Crimea. Within that, we've also looked at certain illicit shipping practices that have been taking place in that area. We've looked at the news surrounding suspected theft of Ukrainian grain, by Russian and Syrian bulk carriers. We provide an update on Russian oil movements. We provide an update on Russian supply chain activity, and we advise on any recent trends that we've seen. And then we also look at the recent alert published by the US Bureau of Industry and Security and Financial Crime Enforcement Network, which was published at the end of June, in which they alerted financial institutions to stay vigilant against sanctions evasion, specifically Russian sanctions. And within that, they listed some commodities of concern that we have investigated in terms of trade.
Brilliant, pretty exciting topic. So let's start with the vessel activity. Has there been much development in terms of the vessel activities in the Crimea JWC high risk zone?
Yeah, so what we did is we looked, or we took data from our Maritime Intelligent Risk Suite product, MERS, and we essentially analysed vessel movements in the JWC high risk zone in and around Crimea. We found that there were 414 vessels in the area as of July 25th, which was an increase on the 373 that we reported in the previous report. We specifically focused on bulk carriers and cargo vessels, and we found that from March to June, the number of vessels going dark dramatically increased in that particular region. So this kind of highlights the concerns around vessels engaging in illicit activity in high-risk zones, and the fact that they could potentially be using that time being dark to make unsolicited port calls to areas in and around Crimea, Ukraine and Russia. We found that as of July 25th, there were 109 vessels that had been dark for 7 days or more in the Crimea region. And it was interesting that the most frequently called ports for those vessels was Sevastopol, Azov, and Temerik, ports which are known to have multiple terminals for dry bulk carriers.
That's pretty interesting. So talking of dry bulk carriers, I would be very keen to understand what's your take on various news reports stating that the Ukrainian grains have been stolen by the Russian vessels and they're being traded off to other countries.
Yeah, so there has been several news reports on this, that Ukrainian grain has been stolen by Russia. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry reported that over 400,000 tons of grain had been stolen from areas in southern Ukraine. The US State Department also provided intelligence claiming that multiple vessels were carrying unsolicited shipments of grain from Ukraine. We looked at some of those vessels that they identified using our MERS product, and I'm going to provide you guys with one example of a vessel that we found. So the vessel in question is the Matros Poznich. So this vessel's registered owner is on the US Treasury OFAC list. It's on Australia's DFAT entity list, and it's also on Switzerland's entity list. The vessel itself had made several journeys back and forth between Turkey and Russia, and in that time, or in that time that is, it had been making that journey. It had frequently been switching off its AIS transponder for more than 24 hours as well. On one of the journeys that it took from Turkey to Russia, on June 6th, the vessel made an additional anchorage visit to Kerch in Ukraine. So Kerch is one of the main ports in Ukraine that has the terminals where it can load grain onto bulk carriers. So that was one of the first things that we thought was relatively interesting. After it remained in that anchorage for 6 hours, it then went dark, so the AIS transponder was switched off. It was switched off for a total of 122 hours, and its reported destination when it switched off its transponder was Kavkaz in Russia. So the dark period of 5 days off the shores of Crimea was a compliance risk in itself. When the transponder was switched back on, the reported draft of the vessel was an increase of 4.6. So this implies high risk in terms of the fact that the vessel was dark for 5 days, so it could have made a sanctioned port call outside of what was specified on the trade document, for example. And then in that time, it could have picked up cargo as per the draft changed or as per the draft increasing. So making an unsolicited, unspecified cargo transfer potentially. We also found several other vessels making similar journeys between kind of Russia, Turkey, and Syria, specifically bulk carriers, all making or all switching off their transponders and all going between those countries that I've just mentioned as well. And the fact that we were able to find several other vessels means that potentially the scale of these grain shipments is unknown in terms of how much was actually stolen. So that 400,000 that I mentioned at the beginning by the Ukraine Defense Ministry, like potentially could be accurate, but it's definitely unknown. It's worth noting that as of today, or as of July 22nd, Russia and Ukraine did agree a UN-backed deal where they would allow shipments from the Ukraine without any issue. And as of August 3rd, the first shipment from Ukraine did actually go and is on its way to Lebanon. So, now we shouldn't see much dark activity specifically for that action of picking up grain from the Ukraine or from that region. But the fact that it has happened for the last 3 months is pretty interesting and kind of validates what we've been told and what we've seen.
Thanks, Ravi, for that analysis. So now let's move on to the Russian oil movements. I'm pretty sure everybody's going to be interested in that. So can you just give us a quick update on what you found on Russian oil movements?
Yeah, so for Russian oil movements, we looked at our commodities at sea product, CAS, and essentially we looked at the latest statistics on Russian origin oil currently on the water. So the data was taken from the 25th of July, and we found that there were 77.5 million barrels of oil on the water, on 100 vessels on the water, and that these vessels were mostly destined for India and China. It's interesting that the next two importers of Russian oil by size or by volume were two European countries, so countries in the European Union, Italy and Netherlands. On June 3rd, the EU announced that they will they will ban essentially the import of Russian oil, but this will not go into effect until December 5th. So that's obviously 4 months away now. But it's interesting then that obviously since the sanctions have started to be imposed from February, March, and we've seen other European countries stop doing trading with Russia or stop trading goods with Russia, in the scenario for oil, Italy has in fact increased its dependency on Russian oil, and it's actually the largest European importer of Russian oil as of July 25th. We also investigated reports in regards to Greek registered vessels being used to transport Russian oils to countries globally. We found, as of the same date, July 25th, 22 vessels sailing under the Greek flag and capable of carrying crude oil that had left from Russia and that were on their respective journeys, potentially loaded with Russian oil. As an extension of that, we looked at some of the vessel operators that were registered to not only Greece, but then also Malta and Cyprus, to essentially review their journeys in the past 6 months and to kind of understand what these European vessel operators had been doing in terms of transporting oil. So we found that there was actually an increase in European vessel operators carrying Russian oil, not only now, but essentially from the moment that sanctions began in February for other types of goods, there was an increase in Russian oil being carried by these European vessel operators month to month up to June that we have the data for. So that's quite interesting. Um, this analysis kind of backed the statement from the Institute of International Finance that stated that over 58 million barrels of Russian oil were being transported by ships linked to Greece, Malta, and Cyprus, and that was an increase of almost 85% in comparison to February prior to the invasion.
Brilliant. So that's some insights that you've provided there. So let's now move on from the grains and the oil and look at the whole of Russian supply chain. Now that multiple governments around the world have imposed sanctions on specific goods, how do you see it impacting the trade with Russia and other countries?
Yeah, so for this, we use yet again another solution with the maritime and trade, S&P Global. So we use the Global Trade Analytics Suite, and we use this product to check trade flows to and from Russia. So the data was taken from May 2022, which gave us kind of the full data set of kind of inflows and outflows of Russia with their trading partners. So as expected, China remained a key trading partner for Russia, and there was actually an increase of trade in the between Russia month to month. The largest kind of import from Russia for China was mineral fuel and oils. So that's obviously something that we would have expected to see. Other large increases in imports from Russia came from the Ivory Coast, South Africa, and Switzerland. Switzerland is obviously the most interesting one, being a European country. We looked specifically at the goods that Switzerland had been importing from Russia, and their main import from Russia was actually Russian pearls in the month of May, with a value of $220 million compared to just $20 million in April. That's interesting just based off of the fact that in July, so a few weeks ago, the European Union introduced a seventh round of sanctions. And within that, they have included jewelry, which would include pearls, watches, and gold. So the expectation will be if we revisit this data and we look at the months of, say, July into August, when we get the data, we should see that Switzerland has reduced its imports of those Russian pearls almost to zero based on the fact that they are now technically sanctioned. With that analysis, we then revisited Singapore because that's what we focused on last year, though that was not last year, in the previous report, sorry. So for Singapore, they have obviously introduced sanctions against Russia as well. So we actually found that for a lot of goods that they would have imported previously from Russia, as of May 22, and the data that we have, a lot of those figures are now zero. So nickel, iron, steel, aluminium, pearls, that's all down to zero. So they've stopped importing that from Russia completely. In regards to exports to Russia, we noticed a continuous trend with what we had previously analyzed. So again, China and Turkey remain key export partners for Russia. China continues to export nuclear reactors and specific types of electronic machinery to Russia, because that potentially could be deemed dual use. And then other countries such as Brazil and India and South Africa, they all maintain steady export trade with Russia as well. We looked at another type of potential dual use good in the form of optical instruments, which has obviously quite a broad definition. And we found that for South Africa and Brazil, their exports to Russia had increased by over 60% in comparison to to February to Russia for those types of goods as well. So those goods are important that I've mentioned, obviously nuclear reactors, electronic machinery, and then also um, the optical instruments, because they are dual use goods, they are regulated by export control. So it'll be interesting that those countries would continue to trade that with Russia and actually increase the amount of goods that they're trading with them.
Okay, thanks, Ravi. So, pretty interesting trends there. Just to conclude, can you give us a bit more insight into the recent US BIS and FinCEN advisory that has been released, basically reaffirming the responsibility for financial institutions to maintain their compliance programs to ensure that there is no sanction evasion techniques being employed?
Yeah, so the US Bureau of Industry and Security, US BIS, and then the Financial Crime Enforcement Network, FinCEN, they released a joint alert on June 28th. And like you said, it was a reminder to financial institutions involved in trade finance to stay vigilant against sanctions evasion, specifically Russian sanctions. Um, the alert provided an overview on the current export restrictions. They provided information on specific commodities of concern, and they also provided information on specific transshipment points around the world that could be used to then re-export goods to Russia. So in regards to the commodities of concern, they listed specific goods such as GPS systems, integrated circuits, antennas, and reflectors as goods to specifically look out for because of the fact that they could be used to proliferate Russia's war efforts against Ukraine, goods that could directly be used in military applications to help them fight the war against Ukraine. So we used our global trade analytics suite product to analyze the volume of trade between Russia and their trade partners for those specific types of goods that I've just mentioned. And essentially, we did a comparison between January, so before any restrictions were in place, and then May, obviously, when lots of trade sanctions have been enforced. So, one example I'll give is for integrated circuits. So, in the month of May, most European countries, including Germany and France, as well as Canada and the US, and then also Singapore, all massively reduced the amount of trade of those specific goods in May to Russia. In comparison to January, when there were no restrictions, there was a relative amount of trade between the two countries of those goods. In comparison, China, Turkey, and India all reported larger amounts of trade of integrated circuits being exported to Russia in May in comparison to January. So that to me seems like as soon as the sanctions were introduced or imposed, and the EU and the Americas and then parts of Asia started to impose sanctions, Russia essentially looked for the countries where they had close ties to, so China, India, and Turkey, and essentially just began trading those goods with them. So they've just redirected where they're going to get those goods from.
Thanks, Ravi. It's pretty interesting to see the different methodologies being applied here. So I expect these trends will continue in the months if the war were to continue. As we come to the end of this discussion, is there any final comment that you would like to make?
Yeah, so I guess what our August update paper has shown is that some of the things that we saw in May continued in August, and if we were to revisit this again towards the end of the year, the same data or similar data would probably show up again. So things like illicit shipping practices, dark activity in high risk areas will continue because that's just how certain conspirators try to continue to trade illegally. So that's going to happen. Um, I believe, or I think, that there will be more of an emphasis on checking from a compliance perspective, ship to ship transfers following this alert from the US BIS and FinCEN, because of the fact that they list specifically certain transshipment points around the world where goods can be exported to then be re-exported to Russia. So countries like Brazil, countries like South Africa, the UAE, things like that, countries that aren't sanctioned, they're essentially saying that those goods that are essentially going to end up in Russia are being first sent to Brazil, South Africa, the UAE, and then being re-exported. So ship-to-ship transfers will become something that needs to be focused on as well. Um, In regards to regional export control regulations and then restricted goods and sanctioned goods, as long as the war continues, or as long as Russia, you know, keeps trying to take over Ukraine, I expect regulators to continue to restrict goods, if not increase and expand the sanctions on goods, so new goods will be introduced. And like I said to you, if we were to revisit this data again later in the year, we should expect to see very similar trends to what we've seen so far.
Thank you very much, Ravi, for the detailed analysis as well as your insights. And also thank you all for listening. Please do not forget to subscribe to the podcast and make sure you don't miss our next episode. Once again, thank you, everyone.